Hey guys, we are continuing in our series on the life of David this Sunday, and we're going to be looking at the story of David and Bathsheba. So, a story almost all of our students are probably familiar with, and we're going to be driving home one main point from that story, which is a quote from an old Puritan pastor that the seed of every sin known to man lies in my heart, or your heart, or our hearts. And so that's the point we'll be driving home, that we, like David, are not immune from falling into life-changing, serious, egregious sin, and we need to be aware of that. So that's the main point, and then the responses, if we're going to accept that truth as biblical and true about ourselves, then we should respond with being humbled, being watchful, and being open to rebuke and correction from others. So that's the outline for my message in the large group time. And then discussion questions are as follows. You hit that first question like we have been. If anybody has comments or questions or things that they would like to dive a little deeper into, give them that chance at first. Second, I'll give one practical way, and really kind of two practical ways to be watchful over ourselves. What does it mean to be watchful over ourselves and our sin and our lives? But there are probably other ways that you or students can brainstorm, and so ask them what are other applicable ways that we can be watchful in our lives to avoid falling into serious sin like David did. And then I have this example that I'm probably going to use, at least with our group. You guys can choose whether or not to use it. I wanted to put it in my lesson, but didn't have time. So there's this pastor, his name's Garrett Kell. You don't have to use his name. He's kind of an up-and-coming pastor that's is becoming popular in some of the circles that I read, and so I've heard a lot about him recently, and he has this powerful testimony about how the sin of pornography had a stronghold on his life, even into his marriage and into the early years of him pastoring at a church. And he talks about how much that sin cost him, and when he eventually had to confess that to his wife and to his kids and to his church, and how dark of a path and a time that was in his life. And so he's someone who has an example of falling into pretty serious, significant, costly sin. And today, years after that, he would say, still, if you offered me $10 million, you told me I needed to go find something explicit on my phone or my computer or my TV at home, I would not be able to do that. Like, it's not possible with how tightly he has things locked down in regards to his technology. And I think for a lot of Christians, we can view that one of two ways. And a lot of Christians, I think, view a story like that and we think, isn't that kind of like weak? Like, don't you want to be in a place in your faith where you're strong enough to resist temptation, and you don't just have to like eliminate all temptation by locking all of your technology down? Isn't that kind of weak? Don't you want to get to a place where you can move past that? Is, I think, the way a lot of Christians would view that story. But actually, I think this is kind of the perfect example of being humble and being watchful, which is what we're going to try to encourage students to do on Sunday morning. He, even as he's writing books and speaking at conferences and pastoring and strong in his walk with the Lord, does not presume that he is above falling back into that sin or falling into some sort of egregious sexual sin. He doesn't assume like that he is ever above that. And so he's not too proud and not too ashamed to admit that he wants and needs every help possible to be watchful and fight against sin and temptation. And so I think we're prone to view that as a weird approach, and like we want to move past those kind of tactics in our lives. But really, I think he would embrace this truth that the seed of every sin lies in his heart. And so he wants to be extra humble and extra watchful over himself and his family. So I'm going to use that example. You can, you don't have to, but it's there for you if you want to. Question 3, is, why do you think, what are the reasons that this truth, that the seed of all sins live in our hearts, is a difficult truth for us to grasp and come to terms with and accept about ourselves? I think there are lots of reasons, but I give two there. One is that we don't know our own hearts as well as we should, and the other is that we don't know other people very truly or very well, very deeply. And then the next question just builds off of that, of if those really do contribute to us not being able to accept that that statement is true of us, that all the seed of every sin is in our hearts. How do we go about solving those two things, that we don't know our hearts very well and we don't know others all that well? And so I've listed a couple of options there for each. The read and interpret the Bible as if it's addressing you is when you're reading in daily devotion, when you're listening to a sermon, to internalize that to yourself. We can get in this habit of reading the Bible as if it's just talking about like the general human population, and that's for someone far out there, or that's talking about someone else. And if we read and listen to sermons much more like they're describing our lives, we'll be much more prone to have our hearts revealed to us and what's really inside of them. The rest that is there is probably self-explanatory, and there are probably other things that you can think of and students can think of for how we could go about knowing our own hearts and knowing other people a little bit better. Question 5 is to just go through the story of Peter. Denying Jesus is another, it's kind of a perfect other story that exemplifies everything that we'll really talk about on Sunday. And so you can just go through that and see how you see all of the elements that we talk about on Sunday in Peter's story. Peter is, like David, was a strong follower of the Lord, a great guy, a hero in some sense in Scripture. And he denies this principle, essentially. When Jesus confronts him and says that you're going to deny me, Peter essentially rejects the idea that the possibility for that lies in his heart. He says, that's not possible. I would never do that. I am not capable of that. And that's essentially a rejection of this idea that the seed of every sin really lives inside of us. And that is also a demonstration of pride, which is the opposite of the humility that we're trying to cultivate in students. And that pride leads him to be careless instead of watchful when they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he falls asleep instead of staying awake to pray that he wouldn't enter into temptation. And Peter also was not open to the rebuke of Jesus ahead of time. He's kind of rebuking him when Peter says, I would die for you. And Jesus says, no, actually, you're going to deny me 3 times. And as we've said earlier, he rejects that idea. And so that's kind of that's not being open to rebuke, is someone coming, having enough boldness to come and correct you and rebuke you for what you have done or what you're about to potentially do, and for you to turn them away and say, that's not true, that's wrong. You've got it all wrong, not take them seriously, is kind of what Peter does here with Jesus himself, that's rough. The last question is pretty simple, and you don't have to go through this one if you don't have time. Don't feel like you have to get through all the questions. This is just it's not a bad question to ask if you have extra time, but it's probably the one I would cut if you are running short on time. What are some of the small seeds of sin that can be present in our hearts, and what are the major sins that they can lead to? And so I've got a list here of some sins, and I'm sure there are more, that, there can be the presence of anger and lust and greed and gossip and slander that are really small, respectable sins like we talked about in life groups last spring, and yet in the seed of that sin can grow serious, life-altering, life-changing sin, which is listed there for you too. So those are our questions for Sunday. Let me know if you have any questions ahead of time, and I'll see you guys then.